Well, let's talk to political commentator Noah Khogali, who joins us now. Good to see you this morning, Noah. Look, where are we in terms of NATO? Because it seems to me, it seems to most people watching, that it's almost inevitable now that Finland and Sweden will be given a pretty fast-track entrance into the alliance.
Yeah, good morning. There's a couple really interesting dynamics at play here. Obviously, straight off the bat, it looks like Finland are going to apply officially on Wednesday. There have been sounds that Sweden will submit their application at the exact same time. And you'd imagine that lots of these discussions over the next couple of days are just going to be ironing out any concerns, any of the creases in terms of the actual application process, in terms of if everybody's happy with it, that some NATO members might still have. So specifically, I'd be looking at France. Obviously, there's been some interesting discussions between Macron and Zelensky over the past few days, where Zelensky's come out of it seemingly a little bit frustrated that France is trying to act as a peace broker and seemingly still sees like there's a way for Russia to get out of this, possibly by Ukraine conceding some territory. Obviously, that's not gone down very well in Ukraine, but the ramifications that could have in terms of Finnish and Swedish membership of NATO when France obviously doesn't want to rile Russia up anymore could be very interesting. It is worth obviously bearing in mind that because they're foreign ministers, they're not the presidents, the prime ministers. There's not going to be massive amounts of decision making made. There'll be lots of discussions that they'll then end up taking back to their home country, and then moving forward, that might inform the decision. So I wouldn't expect anything massive this weekend coming straight out of those meetings, which, as you said, are supposed to be informal, but we'll see.
Yes, and we'll be seeing them arrive at this meeting very soon. If they're not already arriving, we'll bring you pictures as soon as we can. What will Vladimir Putin be thinking, really, do you think, when he sees this happening?
I think that there'll be a lot of concern. Obviously, there's an 800-mile land border between Finland and Russia, which immediately, if they're joining NATO, isn't going to fill him with confidence. And the potential for, and this, it would be a big step, but for the relocation of nuclear armaments to Finland and Sweden, which would put them a lot closer to Russia and make everything a lot more tense. I would assume that's Russia's main concern, as is Kaliningrad being completely surrounded. But I would assume that's mainly what they're worried about. We will see whether he actually ever does anything. That phone call with Finland obviously is concerning. But one would assume that the mutual defence agreement between Finland and the UK, which was signed last week, basically ensures that Finland's not going to get touched militarily by Russia. They might feel the brunt of some more sanctions. I would assume that's the route that Russia are threatening to go down, because realistically, that if they invaded Finland or Sweden now, or engaged in any type of military conflict, that is more of an affront to NATO than the Ukraine war ever was, ever is, ever could be, and would probably drag NATO into it at that point, one would assume.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating thing. We try and work out the psychology of Putin in all of this, because he's played such a bad game with all of this strategically, because he has not only unified NATO, it looks like he's increasing the size of NATO. He's achieved the exact opposite of what he wanted, and yet saying that in some respects, he's still got to find a way of walking away from this.
Yeah, I think he was probably deceived by the fact that so few NATO countries are hitting, for example, their military spending targets. He probably took that as a sign that people weren't very invested in NATO. There wasn't this unity that we all kept saying there was, and thought there was an opportunity there. Oddly, since last year, so early 2022, only 8 countries in NATO were hitting their 2% military spending target. That's down from what it was the year before. He's probably reversed that, but wrongly took those very, very simple raw numbers as an opportunity and took them in isolation rather than looking at the broader, financial and geopolitical landscape. That's his gravest mistake, but he seems to keep making them. So you do really have to worry who's advising him and whether he's actually taking any advice anymore, because he seems to be acting increasingly erratically, which could be the death throes of this conflict, really. But one also has to be very, very concerned about what a man that is desperate will do next.
It does seem cruelly ironic, doesn't it, that today the NATO leaders are meeting in Berlin to discuss the possible inclusion of Finland and Sweden, and yet the one country that needs help the most, Ukraine, is sort of not going to join NATO, and nobody can actually say it out loud, and they're almost having to promise they never will, and there's a war going on in their own country.
Yeah, it's really, really tough because there seems to be this quite large gulf between what people are saying on a leadership level and what they're actually doing. I hate to bring up Eurovision, but you saw last night how much public sentiment they have behind them. But that's not necessarily translated across Europe into actual action to help them. The UK obviously has done a huge amount in terms of their military and financial support, but other countries in Europe haven't done the same. Partially, obviously, and this has been gone over time and time again, because they're worried about the energy situation, but also because they are terrified of getting dragged into a war that they don't know whether they can win, because for decades we've all been terrified about Russia's military power, and suddenly that appears to not be so strong, but nobody really wants to check. Nobody wants to kick that wasp's nest a little bit more and see. So there has been this closing up of ranks, and unfortunately, and perhaps wrongly, Ukraine has ended up on the wrong side of that, isolated, and kind of getting these handouts, behind the back to see whether they can hold on a little bit longer. There were people that thought that Kiev was going to fall in 72 hours. What are we now, 80 days in? And they're still standing. But to be honest, Europe can't take that much credit for that. That's the perseverance of the Ukrainian people that have made that happen.
OK. Noah, really good to talk to you this morning. Thank you very much indeed. That's political commentator Noah Khogali.